How are local governments blocking churches from caring for the homeless? What's the difference between a government shutdown and hitting the debt ceiling? And how do markets work to get Christmas presents on time? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the basement of a church where we've been hiding from the fire marshal for several days now. Christmas time is here, and it's a time for celebrating with your family, giving people gifts, but also a time for charity, for caring for people who are less well off. And that happens more at the end of the year, partly because of Christian virtue and partly because of the tax code encouraging people to get their charitable contributions in before the tax year ends. But regardless of the motive, this is a time when a lot of charitable activity goes on, and we've seen government sometimes get in the way of that. And Christian Britschgi is a reporter for Reason magazine, and he has covered how local governments especially can get in the way of caring for the poor. Thanks so much for joining us, Christian.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So let's start with this story that you've been following out of Ohio that involves a town, a small town, which is basically going after a church, a pastor there who is opening up his building to allow homeless people to stay in it overnight. And they view this as a zoning violation and a fire code problem. The church sees it differently, though.
Yeah, sure. So you're referring to Dad's Place, which is a non-denominational church in Bryan, Ohio. So since March 2023, they've been in this building in the town's downtown. Beginning in November of 2023, the pastor there, Chris Avell, had been letting, as you mentioned, homeless people sleep in the church, take refuge there. They provided food, a place to sleep, a place to do laundry, while they also conducted their ministry, preaching to the homeless or preaching to anyone who would come into the church. Beginning in, I believe, November of last year, the city started to take issue with this. They had police and fire officials continually coming over to the shelter, citing them for violations, telling them that, their various parts of the building are not up to fire code to have people in the building, that it's commercially zoned, and therefore, you can't have people sleep in it because that's a residential use. But the church insisted that this was part of their ministry. It was a religiously protected, free exercise of their faith, and so that they were going to keep letting people stay there while they, preached the gospel. Eventually, this escalated to criminal charges being filed against the pastor on New Year's Day of this year. And this is set, which is, criminal charges related to zoning code violations or fire code violations are exceptionally rare. But, and this has set a contentious back and forth between the church, its pastor, and the town ever since. After the charges, the church, it constantly, in response to all these different safety concerns, changing safety concerns that the town kept raising, they, made improvements. They responded to what the town was telling them to do, and continually the town would come back and say, oh no, you need to do this, X, Y, and Z that we didn't tell you to do before. There's been brief settlements where the town agreed to drop criminal charges while the church made improvements. And then after they would make the improvements, the town would then come again and charge them with criminal charges all over again. So where we're at right now is there's two relevant legal cases. One is a civil lawsuit by fire officials against the town. The other is the criminal charges. A state court just ruled against the church on the civil charges, saying that they do have to kick everyone out and not let people sleep there. That decision's been stayed while, they appeal to a higher court. And then we've also had the criminal trial happen, although there's no ruling yet. We expect a ruling around Christmas time, perhaps ironically enough.
So why is the town doing this? I mean, why do they care so much about this that they're willing to invest years of effort into trying to get this church to stop caring for homeless people?
The town's argument has consistently been that it's unsafe for people to stay in the church, that the building is not a residential building, it's not zoned to be residential, and it doesn't have these various features of, the fire code features, including a sprinkler system that you would normally require of, a multi-family residential building. The arguments from the church are twofold. One is that the building is in fact safe. It's not a fire risk. It's not a hazard. They've made, they've responded to the city's various, complaints about, they had a gas powered dryer, things like that. The other argument that they've made on the safety issue is, the building is a lot safer than forcing people to sleep outside in 20-degree weather. And, I think, if you wanted to look beyond some of the town's stated arguments, this is very typical, we might call NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, that we see in towns across the country that are reported and, all over the place, where towns, they don't like the homeless. They assume that providing services to them is what causes homelessness, or causes the homeless at least to be in that area of town. And they'd rather have something else there. And so they use the voluminous requirements of their zoning codes to crack down on these kinds of uses.
And so these are all local regulations, and none of this is coming from the federal government. A lot of times when we talk about regulation, we talk about the federal government for good reason. There's lots of that too. But this all comes from local government. Is this a problem just in this one locality, or do we see this stuff happening all over the country?
No, depressingly enough, this is something that's actually remarkably common. Just this year, within the past 2 months or so, I think I've reported on 4 other cases of towns weaponizing their land use regulations to stop private organizations, nonprofit organizations, from providing charitable services to the homeless. There was a case recently in Montana where a local warming center, privately funded warming center, where it would give people a place to stay overnight, had their permit yanked from them, without any sort of real cause, right when temperatures are dropping below freezing. That was in Montana. Elsewhere, there was the Department of Justice recently just sued a Georgia community for also trying to shut down a local church's homeless ministry. That the federal lawsuit is in pursuant to federal protections for religious land uses. But this is a constant problem all across the country. Back in 2022, I wrote a story called "A Zoning versus the Good Samaritan," which sums up numerous of these cases. And it's it happens because, as I mentioned, the local governments often don't responding to neighborhood complaints, don't care for having the homeless around, don't operating on this idea that homeless shelters are what's bringing people to the community. And also because there's zoning codes, when you separate out land uses into residential, commercial, industrial, that doesn't leave a lot of space for these other types of uses that kind of fall in between those categories. Is a church a commercial use? If it's sheltering people, is it a residential use? Well, it's not so clear. And towns, because they already don't, like these services sometimes being in their town, will use, the strict definitions of the law to go after churches doing this kind of charitable activity.
And so what it sounds like you're saying is that zoning laws kind of provide a sort of catch-all for local governments to go after various things that they don't like for many different reasons, simply because, like you said, if you interpret them very strictly and go exactly by the letter, there's lots and lots of perfectly normal and acceptable stuff that just doesn't really fit into that framework.
Yeah, totally. So, the 2022 story I mentioned, I covered a case of 2 cases. One was a church in Brookings, Oregon, that was operating a soup kitchen out of its church, perfectly normal church activity. But then the town said, oh, wait, hold on, you're in a residential area, soup kitchen, that's a commercial use, so therefore you're not allowed to do this. Same story, I covered another example out of New York where a church, a building they own, they decided to turn it into a warming center during the winter. it was in the downtown area, and the church said, similar to the Ohio case, they said, "Oh, whoa, hold on, this is a commercially zoned building, and your shelter is a residential use, so you can't do that either." There was another interesting case I covered out of Pennsylvania where the church was they had a pantry and an area where a service where people could come and get like razors, toiletries, do laundry, things like that, and it was zoned. The zoning code actually laid out specific church uses. And the zoning official said, "Oh, well, hold on, giving out, goods charitably to the homeless, that's not in our prescribed, definitions of what churches do. And so therefore you're violating the zoning code." If you kind of think of the hubris there of a local planning department deciding, here's what true religion involves.
Yeah, it seems like that at least seems like a very clear First Amendment problem where I feel like if you took that to a constitutional court, they would be like, "Oh, well, clearly that's allowed. That's free exercise of religion." How have those sorts of challenges been successful?
Yes. So the conflict is between courts who have, on the one hand, generally upheld pretty sweeping protections for free exercise of religion. The federal law actually goes beyond this in some ways. There's something called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, or RLUIPA, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically says that local governments are not allowed, basically says local governments we're going to apply strict scrutiny to local government land use regulations of religious uses. So the local governments can only regulate religious land uses I'm forgetting the exact language, but, is like a most compelling government interest and is narrowly tailored just to further that interest. On the other side of things is courts generally have been very permissive of any sort of government zoning regulation, saying, hey, this is all part of your normal police powers to regulate health and safety and all that stuff. And so that's kind of the contours of these legal cases where churches have sued under RLUIPA or First Amendment, under the First Amendment. Generally, they've been successful. The Oregon case I mentioned, they were successful there. The DOJ, which, as a libertarian, I'm not my favorite organ of the government, but has been relatively good and aggressive about protecting churches' rights to do this. But the problem, of course, is that this protects, or twofold. One is that churches are nevertheless having to go through this very arduous, contentious process with the city where they keep trying to put restrictions on their operations and upset their charitable work until they, go into federal court and file a lawsuit and then get these protections. And, all the while the people they're trying to serve are left out in the cold, literally. So that's one problem. And then another problem is that oftentimes these nonprofits are, non-religious, secular nonprofits. And so therefore often don't get those protections that religious institutions do.
So do you think there is a case for this kind of zoning regulation at all? Do you think there's any role for a local government to say, hey, we don't want a homeless shelter to be in this location, we'd prefer it be somewhere else?
Only in the most narrow examples of, maybe there is some very compelling health and safety aspect to saying a homeless shelter shouldn't go in this one area, but not another. But I think that's generally not what you see. And then also local governments, still have plenty of powers to go after actual, damages to people's property or nuisances. And homeless shelters themselves, churches that, provide these services are themselves very eager to be good neighbors and, not allow drug use or loitering or things like that. Local governments have all sorts of powers to prevent, bad behavior in public and those kinds of externalities. Zoning goes much beyond that and allows governments to kind of cynically go after homeless shelters just because, it's not the most desirable land use that they want. I give another example. I covered this case of a homeless shelter in Boise, Idaho that was trying to is land they owned, and they were trying to build a homeless shelter on the land, and it was zoned to allow homeless shelters. And the neighbors, when they complained, they said, hey, no, it shouldn't go here. It should go to another more appropriate area somewhere else in the city. And so the city, working with the homeless shelter, did a huge survey of all the properties in Boise, Idaho. It's like a 70 square mile city, And they found, I believe it was 2 properties that were zoned to allow a homeless shelter, were on the market and were large enough to actually allow the size of the shelter that they were looking to build. One of those was the one that the nonprofit already owned, and then the other was like under an overpass near a Walmart. And so that just goes to show you that, zoning regulations, the steel man case for them is that, it puts, proper uses in the right area, but clearly in practice, it goes way beyond that to just being the most, applying the most restrictive rules to housing that's meant to serve the most vulnerable.
Yeah, so you write a newsletter for a reason, talking about zoning and land use more generally. What are some things that we can do as reforms to this to try to make the system actually work better?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. So one, just on the narrow aspect of homeless shelters, would be to reduce really excessive permitting requirements that are required to open these up, and then also pare back zoning regulations that are really prescriptive about where these kinds of buildings can go. Normally a homeless shelter is going to require a conditional use permit, which takes, at best a few months to get, and oftentimes takes years because there's some discretion on the part of the city, and it also allows all sorts of public comment, and so that can stretch things out even more. More globally, I would just say cities should be much more permissive about allowing people to build housing. State governments have a role here too. The research is pretty clear that the less housing construction that you have and the higher housing costs that you have, the more homelessness you're going to have. So, just by allowing private people to, not even operate homeless shelters, but just build for-profit housing, you'll have less homelessness. And on top of that, if you have much less homelessness, it's much easier to deal with the smaller homeless population that you do have, and, some of the problems associated with that. So, for instance, Houston is a great example, very permissive land use regime, and they've effectively eliminated veteran homelessness, and land prices are so low that the city is able to go around and buy up, cheaper hotels and find housing for people who are already on the streets. This is in no way an option for a place like San Francisco, where, any piece of land is going to cost millions of dollars because of, your excessive land use regulations, and any sort of market rents or, thousands of dollars for, the tiniest unit. In that environment, you're going to have huge amounts of homeless people. You're going to have huge amounts of homeless people on the street, and any sort of government money or government program that you would devote to try to solve this problem, it just can't deal with the scale of it. So, generally just giving people a little more freedom and more property rights will go a long way to dealing with the root, these root causes of why you have so many people on the streets.
One of the things that we hear a lot, especially on a small government point of view, is the idea that local is better, right? So, pushing power down to lower levels of government rather than being at the national level or even at the state level is better, because those governments are closer to the people that they represent and work for, and are probably going to be more responsive to their needs, and that's a better way to govern. But then I read your coverage on what local governments actually do, and sometimes I think, is there actually anything better about local governments? Because it seems very systematic in the way that they do this. It's, as we said, it's not just a couple of random cities that are doing this. You find stories of this all over the country, and it always seems to play out in a very similar way, and in a way that's really pretty bad for government, pretty bad for the people who live there. Has any of this reporting that you've done sort of made you question the virtue of local governments relative to the national government?
Yes, absolutely. On this issue particularly, I'm not a huge fan of the federal government either. But two thoughts, I guess I would say. One is local governments, they respond to the interests of the local community. But when it comes to housing and homelessness, oftentimes the interest of the local community is that we want to exclude uses and exclude people. And because it's just dealing with a smaller area, they believe they have the power and the ability to do that. So, I mentioned, these small towns, they often go after people providing homeless services on this kind of mistaken assumption that, if we don't allow it to happen here, the homelessness will go somewhere else, right? they have this belief that they can just kind of exclude it and get away from the problem. And so I think there is definitely a role for higher levels of government or, constitutional protections for property rights to put limits on what local governments can say, or local government rules about what you can do with your land. That being said, I don't think the federal government or state governments are really benevolent actors or have, their intervention is always for the best in these cases. So in California and then at the federal level too, there's been this huge push going back to the Bush administration, basically telling local governments, with a lot of, giving them a lot of money to pursue this particular approach to homelessness, which is, housing first. Instead of building shelters or doing anything like that, what we're going to do is we're going to build and we're going to fund you to build permanent supportive housing. And that's how you're going to solve your homelessness problem. These programs are massively expensive. And when you already regulate land use really restrictively, there's just no amount of money that's going to, into housing first programs that's going to solve your homelessness problem, right? And then also as, free marketers, we understand that if you spend a lot of money building below market goods, there's just, below market priced goods, there's no way you're going to ever satisfy demand. And so there will always be excess demand. So, I think local governments have a really productive role to play here. And I think it is true that they know their local communities best. At the same time, that doesn't mean that they should just have carte blanche to do whatever they want. We should put some guardrails on the most nefarious forms of regulation and then allow them a lot of freedom of action to, do productive things that they have the knowledge to do.
And we should probably let churches care for the poor too.
Yeah, sure. That might be a good idea as well.
All right. Thanks so much for talking to us, Christian.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
So, as I'm recording today, which is on Friday, the 20th of December, Congress is facing a looming government shutdown deadline. This is a Christmas tradition, just like many other Christmas traditions. It's just much less fun. And by the time you are listening to this, we will already know what the result of that was. I, right now, don't know what the result of it's going to be. And so what I just wanted to do really quick is just describe the difference between a government shutdown and the debt ceiling and what these things mean, because I think sometimes these terms just get thrown around a lot and it can be a little bit confusing. So the first thing to get is that a government shutdown is not the same thing as hitting the debt ceiling. Those are different things. A government shutdown happens because of a thing called the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says that the government can't spend money that wasn't appropriated by Congress. Now, that's a good rule. We don't want the government spending money that wasn't appropriated by Congress. That law was sort of passed as a anti-corruption measure back in the 1800s. So there are these deadlines that are built in to the appropriations process. So Congress funds the government for a set period of time. When that period of time is up, if Congress doesn't pass more appropriations, then the government shuts down. And what does it really mean when the government shuts down? Well, a lot of the stuff the government does just keeps happening because it's considered essential and does not get actually shut down. The biggest direct effects are on the economy of the area in and around Washington, D.C., which is largely reliant on federal workers and federal contractors. The larger economic implications of it are generally quite small. Now, that doesn't mean that shutdowns are not a big deal. They are. They also, as a political tactic, have proven time and time again to be futile. They don't really accomplish much of anything. If you can sort of imagine it as a negotiating tool to say, do this or else we'll shut down the government, Republicans have tried this several times and it has never worked out for them. And so I've argued in the past that government shutdowns are actually pretty silly and Congress can change the law to get rid of them. There have been legislative proposals in the past to do that. They generally follow the form of something like the following. So you hit the appropriations deadline, after which the government is technically out of money. And if you don't pass a new appropriations bill in time, a automatic continuation of the current spending levels will go for 2 weeks, just to give you a little bit more time. Then, if you don't pass something after that, you'll get another automatic bill or automatic spending for 2 weeks, but this time it'll be with 1% cuts across the board for everything in the whole government. If you don't pass it again after those 2 weeks, you get another percentage point cut, and things like that. So what that does is it gives Congress the incentive to actually go and pass the bill, because if they don't want to see those spending cuts happen, then they will be motivated to go actually pass an appropriations bill so that the government doesn't shut down. Because again, the shutdown part, a lot of it is kind of a stunt. It's not really real. Except, like I said, for the economy of the Washington, D.C. area, which ordinarily is doing very, very well and really is not that big of a problem. So that's an entirely separate question from the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling came about in the early 1900s. What it says is that there is a limit, a cap, on how much debt the government is allowed to issue. So this is entirely separate from appropriations, entirely separate from government spending. Congress appropriates a certain amount of money to be spent. If there's not enough revenue to raise that, the Treasury issues bonds to make up the difference. What the debt ceiling does is it limits the amount that the Treasury is allowed to borrow. When that limit gets hit, under the law, the Treasury can't borrow anymore. That doesn't change the obligations that Congress made to spend the money. Those have already been committed. It's a separate issue that says the Treasury can't issue any more debt. And so what happens if you hit the debt ceiling? If you pass that could lead to a default. The United States sovereign default. That is a much, much worse problem than a government shutdown for the overall economy. That does not just affect people in Washington, D.C. That affects everyone. That affects the entire world, quite frankly, because it undermines confidence in the United States currency. It undermines confidence in the United States government's ability to pay back its bondholders. And United States Treasury bonds are probably the most important financial asset in the world. And so if you mess with that, you mess with a lot of stuff. So there's arguments from people that say, well, we should get rid of the debt ceiling too. And these arguments are not without merit. The debt ceiling is a strange convention. I'm fairly certain that the United States is the only country with a provision like this in its fiscal law. Like I said, it doesn't actually control spending. It only controls the amount of debt that the Treasury is allowed to issue. It's always set at a completely arbitrary number. There's no reason for the number to be something rather than something else. And so some people say we should get rid of it. Donald Trump says we should get rid of it. Elizabeth Warren also says we should get rid of it. And again, to a limited point, there are good arguments for doing that. But the difference between the debt ceiling and the government shutdown politically is that the debt ceiling actually has, in the past, allowed for opportunities for spending reform in a way that government shutdowns never have. Brian Riedel at the Manhattan Institute looked at this in a paper he did last year, or an article he wrote for National Review last year, I should say. And what he says is, of the 8 most recent significant deficit reduction bills, and that goes back to the 80s, to Graham-Rudman Act, to Budget Control Act from 2011, and a couple of different things in between there. These were under Democrat and Republican presidents. All 8 of them were attached to the debt ceiling. So basically what they said is, yep, we'll raise the debt ceiling, prevent default, allow the Treasury to issue more debt. In exchange for that, we're going to have these spending reforms. So that's a very normal thing that has been going on for decades. Became a flashpoint in 2023 when Democrats insisted that the debt ceiling increase had to come with no conditions. It just had to be an increase with no reforms attached to it. That was actually out of line with the precedent of how this is normally done. And again, if you look back to the 80s and 90s, this was done with Democrats as well. So both government shutdowns and debt ceilings are kind of arbitrary deadlines that we have in our fiscal law that are kind of unusual and don't make a ton of sense on their own. If I was designing United States fiscal law from the ground up, I probably wouldn't include either of these things in it. But given that we've seen how they've played out, how they've worked, government shutdowns are really something we can get rid of. The debt ceiling is something we should probably keep around from the perspective of wanting to cut government spending, wanting to reform government spending, wanting to change the way that we do appropriations. The debt ceiling has actually allowed for some deficit reduction. Not directly. It doesn't actually reduce the deficit on its own, but as a negotiating tool and as leverage that Congress can use to say, we'll raise the debt ceiling, and in exchange for that, we want these spending reforms. So back to some more fun Christmas stuff, which is presents. Every year, a bunch of people spend a lot of money in December. We see this every year if you look at consumer spending. It's very interesting. January is usually the lowest month of the year. One of the lowest, but oftentimes it is the lowest month of the year. And December is very high. So what a lot of people do throughout the year is they do a lot more consumer spending in November and December, and then they make up for it by spending less money in January than they would in an average month. And this happens all the time. And a lot of the reason is Christmas, right? People go out, you buy presents for your family, for your friends, and that's extra money that you would not normally spend in any other month. Markets know this. They know this is going to happen. It happens every year. And so what do? You prepare for it. In the same way that consumers smooth out their spending over the year, spending more at the end of the year and less at the beginning of the year, businesses that try to provide for that smooth out their production and their shipping over the year. And so you see a big rush of holiday shipping coming in late summer, early fall. Because they want all that stuff to be in the store, ready for you to buy, because they know that you're going to go buy Christmas presents. And this process works reasonably well. When was the last time there was a shortage of Christmas presents? Now, sometimes there'll be shortage of very specific things that are like extremely popular. A lot of times those are good for business, actually. They want you to be talking about the fact that our product is so popular you can't find it in the stores because everybody bought it already, right? But in general, it's not something you have to worry about. You don't have to worry about thinking like, oh, there's not going to be any presents. I'm not going to have anything to buy. Because businesses are prepared for that. How do they do it? They do it by planning. What I've just described is planning, right? It's planning by consumers, it's planning by businesses. Now, planning might sound like a anti-free market word, right? We don't like the government planning. But this is a point that Hayek made several times, which is that there's all sorts of planning in a market economy. It's just decentralized planning. It's planning by individuals, planning by businesses. There's no central overseer planning the whole thing. And this is exactly what happens every year with Christmas presents. There's nobody in charge of some commission or board or anything out there saying, okay, in order to get the Christmas presents in time, you need to ship this here on this date, and you need to get in line and go to this date, and we need to go to this port for this way. That's not how it works. Businesses look at price signals. They look at consumer preferences, and they use that to plan how they are going to meet the needs of their customers. And so when goods are coming in from all over the world, and even from across the country, right? This is a very big country in the United States. When goods are moving around, there is no central authority planning it. A lot of times what businesses do is they'll work with other businesses that are called freight forwarders. Freight forwarders are middlemen, which is usually used as a negative term. And sometimes it can be. Sometimes middlemen are wasteful. But a lot of times middlemen exist because they have information and relationships that other businesses don't have. And those information and relationships are valuable. And companies are willing to pay to get them. And so freight forwarders have relationships with ocean carriers, with trucking companies, with railroads, with air freight carriers. They route a ton of business through them. And so if you're a small or medium-sized business and you don't have a ton of product that you ship every year, not enough to make a difference for a big national company like FedEx or Norfolk Southern, you're not really going to have that kind of relationship with those carriers. But freight forwarders do. And so you work with them. You pay them in order to figure out how to ship this. But even the freight forwarder, they don't always know what's going on. The crazy thing about shipments and packages and moving stuff is a lot of times nobody really knows where it is. You know where it last was, right? You have a record of it coming in on a port or getting loaded on a truck. But after that, you don't know where it exactly is. It's not like there's like little GPS tracking devices on every package that shows exactly where everything is. What that reflects is a very strong faith in the market system. That the market system actually works. It will get the stuff to where it needs to go based on price signals and based on what you paid for it. That's why, if you're late getting a present for someone and you pay extra, you can probably get it there faster. That's a sign that the market's working, right? If you care less about when it gets there, you can pay less. If you care more about when it gets there, you can pay more. You get what you pay for. That's a good principle. That's a good sign that a market is working, if you can get what you pay for. Well, of course, packages get lost. Happens a lot. Nobody's saying this is perfect. But imagine how much worse it would be if the Secretary of Transportation or somebody was out there trying to route millions of packages all around the country. Or it doesn't even have to be the government. Imagine how much worse it would be if there was some, board of businessmen who were trying to centrally plan this for everybody. It wouldn't work. It would be a disaster. But markets do work, and we know they do, because most of the time, in most cases, people get their Christmas presents on time, despite nobody centrally planning how they moved around. Lots of different people plan, but they do so in a decentralized way that makes sure that your presents get to you and your loved ones on time. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Christian pick the paper of the episode from the Foundation for Economic Education in September 1946 by Milton Friedman and George Stigler. Roofs or ceilings, the current housing problem. Here's Christian to tell you about it.
One of my favorite economics papers of all time is this 1946 paper, Roofs or Ceilings. It was written by Milton Friedman and George Stigler right after World War II, when American cities, because of wartime, needs for raw materials, were suffering huge housing shortages, which was then compounded by a very strict, initially federally enforced, but then later locally readopted rent controls. And what Friedman and Stigler said, in his very dry and clinical paper was, look, if you control the price of housing, you're going to get less housing construction because people are going to invest less. You're going to get shortages because the owners of existing housing are going to take the units off the rental market. And you're going to get lower housing quality because the owners of rental housing that stays on the market are going to have less of an incentive to upkeep their properties. I mean, it's so prescient because rent control regimes have persisted in some American cities, and these are constantly the problems that we've seen with them. All the subsequent academic research backs up their initial diagnosis of the problem. And then it's also just a really interesting paper from, the history of the free market movement. This was one of the first kind of white papers published by the first libertarian think tank, the Foundation for Economic Education, which kind of set this template for, free marketers interested in policy. What do? You form a think tank and you write a white paper about how government policy could be better, even if it's not politically popular. Eventually someone will come around and understand that you were right. And then for me as just a libertarian nerd, it's fun because it also, the reaction to the paper and the very nascent libertarian community at the time kind of foreshadowed all these fights that we're continually having. Because in the paper, Stigler and Friedman, they say, we of course support the government's interest here in intervening to help the poor and furthering equality, but this is a terrible way to do it. You should, do it with free markets instead. And no one hated that more than Ayn Rand, who's like, this is a total sellout to communism. The free market movement has lost its way in 1946. So there's this huge dust up. They ended up putting a very famous footnote on the paper saying, we don't necessarily agree with all the moral reasoning of this paper, even though the policy is sound. So for that reason, it remains my favorite economics paper.
Roofs or Ceilings by Friedman and Stigler. Read it. That's all for today. Remember that the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.